In a place governed by brute force, the most powerful weapon is usually a closed fist. But what happens when a man discovers that true power lies not in the violence he can inflict, but in the words he can write? This is the story of how a prisoner, considered a monster by the system, became a mentor, by teaching other monsters how to find their humanity. Wing 4 was the end of the line. A concrete repository for men society had decided to forget. Here, life was measured in cycles of violence and silence, and power was a currency traded in dusty yards, earned with scars and hard stares. It was to this place that Samuel was sent. He was no different from the others. He had a history of violence that preceded him, and a sentence long enough to erase any memory of a former life. Functionally illiterate, his primary tool for communication was intimidation, his language, force. In the first few years, he was exactly what the system expected him to be: a caged animal, answering brutality with more brutality, letting the gray prison routine grind his humanity into dust. In that universe, words were a luxury, a weakness. His transformation didn't begin with an epiphany, but with a humiliation. His mother, an elderly and tired woman, sent him a letter. It was simple news from the small town where he was born, written in a trembling hand. Samuel held the paper for hours, unable to decipher more than his own name. He had to ask another inmate, a man he despised, to read his own mother's words to him. At that moment, hearing the news from his home in a stranger's voice, Samuel felt a shame deeper and sharper than any physical punishment he had ever endured. He wasn't just a prisoner, he was an ignorant one. The next day, he enrolled in the prison's literacy program. It was a forgotten room with few resources, run by a volunteer teacher, and attended by a handful of men who only wanted the days of sentence reduction. For Samuel, however, it became an obsession. He attacked the alphabet with the same fury he once reserved for his enemies. The first letters were strange shapes, the sounds a barrier. But he persisted. The teacher, a woman named Anna, saw a different spark in his eyes. It wasn't the desire for a reduced sentence, but a desperate hunger for knowledge. She gave him special attention, stayed after hours, and brought simple books from her own home. And slowly, the symbols began to turn into sounds, and the sounds into meaning. To understand the rarity of Samuel's journey, we must look at our mirror case, the story of Beto. Beto was from Samuel's wing, a man forged in the same violence. He saw Samuel's dedication to books as a weakness. For Beto, power in prison followed a traditional path. He involved himself in a dispute for control, used intimidation to subjugate the weak, and tried to solidify his position through force. The result was predictable: a yard fight, a makeshift knife, a wounded opponent, and Beto being dragged to solitary confinement with 5 more years added to his sentence. Beto's story is the system's norm, the tragedy that repeats itself. He sought power that could be seen and touched, and was swallowed even deeper by the monster he tried to master. Samuel's journey, on the other hand, was a silent anomaly, a different kind of power being built in a dusty classroom. After a year of disciplined study, a milestone was reached. A new letter from his mother arrived, and Samuel, alone in his cell, was able to decipher it, word by word. The tears that came were not of sadness, but of a deep, solitary triumph. And then he did something that would change everything. He picked up a pen and paper to reply. His first letter was crude, a cluster of childish handwriting and spelling errors, but it was his. They were his words. And as he wrote, he discovered a new power. On paper, he could be vulnerable. He could organize the chaos of his thoughts. He could say, "I miss you," without his hardened voice failing him. Writing wasn't just communication, it was therapy, a way to reconnect with the man he was before the rage consumed him. His new skill did not go unnoticed. The news that Samuel the Bruiser was now the writer spread through Wing 4 like a strange rumor. One day, an older man, a feared faction leader, approached him, not with a threat, but with a humble request and a crumpled piece of paper. It was his 15-year-old daughter's birthday, a girl he hadn't seen since she was 5. He wanted to send her a letter, but his hands, which only knew the language of force, couldn't form the words of love. Samuel, hesitant, agreed to help. He sat with the man and listened. He heard the stories, the memories, the rough words filled with a profound regret. And Samuel didn't just transcribe them. He filtered them, polished them, he translated them. Let us analyze this extraordinary artifact. The first letter Samuel wrote for another inmate. The man's direct request was, "Tell her Daddy loves her and misses her." A superficial analysis would lead to a literal transcription. But what Samuel wrote was something different. He wrote, "My daughter, today the sun shines brighter in the sky, but in here the only sun I see is the memory of your face. Every day that passes is one less day on my sentence, and one day closer to being able to give you the hug I've been saving for you since I arrived. May your life be as full of joy as you deserve, with the eternal love of your father." Samuel's genius was his newfound emotional intelligence. He understood that these men, labeled as monsters, were not devoid of complex feelings, but of the vocabulary to express them. He became the translator of their hardened souls. His small cell transformed into the most unlikely of offices. Men who had built their reputations on violence now stood in line, waiting patiently to dictate letters. They were love letters to wives who were about to give up. They were apology letters to mothers who had cried for years. They were advice letters to sons who were dangerously starting to follow the same paths. Samuel became the heart of Wing 4, a vital bridge between the isolated world of the prison and the world of emotions outside. The impact of those letters was profound and unexpected. Tensions in the wing, once a constant, began to diminish. Men who reconnected with their families, who received replies, who felt like a part of something again, had fewer reasons to explode into violence. Hope, however slim, was a powerful pacifying agent. Samuel, the former illiterate, had unintentionally become the most effective mediator in the prison, using only pen and paper. His redemption was not a future event to be granted by a judge. It was a daily, silent process, acknowledged only in the grateful eyes of the men he helped. The final test of his transformation and the new power he wielded came years later. A dispute over territory between two rival factions inside the prison reached a boiling point. A riot was being planned. The tension was palpable. The smell of imminent violence was in the air. The guards were preparing for the worst. But then, something extraordinary happened. The leaders of the two factions, instead of meeting for a show of force, sought out Samuel. They didn't want his hands. They wanted his mind and his pen. He spent an entire night in his cell, not sleeping, but mediating. He listened to both sides. And then, he began to draft a peace agreement. It was not a legal document. It was a treaty written in the language they understood, the language of honor, respect, territory, and one's word. He listed the grievances and concessions of each side in a balanced and fair manner. The next morning, in the tense yard, the document was read aloud. A silence fell over the crowd. And then, to the astonishment of the guards watching from the walls, the two leaders looked at each other and nodded. The agreement was accepted. The riot was called off. A man, with the power of the word, had achieved what the force and weapons of the state could not: peace. Samuel served the rest of his sentence. The day he walked out of prison was quiet, without fanfare. Many of the men he had written for were no longer there. But his legacy remained. The story of the writer of Wing 4 became a legend, proof that rehabilitation was more than a myth, even in the most unlikely of places. He never returned to a life of crime. He moved to a small town and dedicated his life to literacy programs in underserved communities. He knew, from experience, that teaching a young person to read and write wasn't just about education. It was about giving them a voice. It was about giving them an alternative to the language of violence. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a man who had found his penance, not in the punishment of the state, but in the act of giving others the same tool that had saved him. He taught monsters how to communicate and in the process rediscovered and rebuilt his own humanity.